Picture a locked cellar in a St. Petersburg palace. 4 men are waiting. One of them has just fed their guest a plate of poisoned cakes, cyanide mixed in by hand, enough to kill several men instantly. Their guest eats 2 of them. Then he asks for more wine. The men exchange glances. Nothing is happening. The poison isn't working, and upstairs, a gramophone keeps playing the same song on repeat over and over, so no one outside can hear what's about to happen next. That guest was Grigori Rasputin, and what happened in that cellar became one of the most retold death stories in modern history. Poisoned, shot, beaten, thrown into a freezing river, still, somehow, refusing to die. For over a century, people have told this story as proof that Rasputin wasn't fully human, that something in him resisted death itself. Here's the twist. Most of that story probably isn't true, and figuring out what actually happened is almost as wild as the legend itself. Let's start with who this man actually was, because his rise alone is strange enough without any of the death legends attached. Rasputin was born a Siberian peasant in a small village with no formal education, no noble blood, and no obvious path to power. By his 20s, he'd become a wandering religious pilgrim, the kind of self-taught holy man Russia had many of at the time. Nothing about his background should have put him anywhere near a royal palace, but by his mid-30s, he was living inside one. Here's how that happened. Tsar Nicholas II and his wife had a son, Alexei, the heir to the Russian throne. Alexei had hemophilia, a blood disorder that meant even minor injuries could become life-threatening. Doctors couldn't help him, nothing worked. Then Rasputin was brought in, and somehow, whenever the boy was in crisis, Rasputin's presence seemed to calm him. His bleeding episodes eased. Nobody, including modern doctors looking back, fully agrees on why. Some think it was simple stress reduction, some think it was coincidence in timing, but to Alexei's parents, especially his mother, it looked like a miracle. And that was enough. Rasputin became untouchable inside the palace, no matter what anyone outside it thought of him. And plenty of people outside the palace thought terrible things. Rumors spread fast. Rasputin drank heavily, in public, without shame. He boasted about his closeness to the royal family. He surrounded himself with scandal instead of avoiding it. Newspapers ran wild stories about his supposed sexual conquests, his hypnotic control over women, his corrupting influence over the throne itself. Some of it was true, a lot of it wasn't, but by 1916, none of that mattered anymore. Russia was losing a war, the economy was collapsing, and a growing number of powerful men had decided Rasputin was the reason why. He had to go, which brings us back to that locked cellar. The most famous version of what happened that night comes from one man, Prince Felix Yusupov, one of the 4 conspirators and by far the wealthiest man in the room. According to Yusupov, the poisoned cakes didn't work. Neither did the poisoned wine. So Yusupov shot Rasputin in the chest at close range. Rasputin fell. The men believed him dead. Yusupov went to check on the body later, and Rasputin, according to this account, suddenly opened his eyes, grabbed Yusupov by the throat, and chased him out into the courtyard. A second conspirator shot him again as he tried to escape. The men finally wrapped his body and threw it through a hole in the ice of a frozen river. When investigators recovered the body days later, they reportedly found water in his lungs. Meaning, according to the legend, Rasputin was still alive when he hit the water. Poisoned, shot twice, and he still had to drown before he'd actually die. It's an incredible story. It's also, according to most historians who have actually dug into it, mostly fiction. Here's the problem. Yusupov didn't write this account the night it happened. He wrote it more than a decade later in exile in Paris after losing his entire fortune in the Russian Revolution. He needed money. He wrote 2 separate memoirs about the murder, years apart, and the details changed significantly between them. The second version was even more dramatic than the first. Historians studying the case have pointed out something simple, but important. This story comes almost entirely from a man who had every reason to make his own crime sound as legendary as possible, and who was literally being paid to tell it. And the physical evidence tells a very different story. A modern forensic review of the surviving autopsy photographs found something the poison and chase legend can't explain. A gunshot wound to Rasputin's forehead, fired at point-blank range. That kind of wound doesn't happen during a chase across a dark courtyard. It happens when someone is close enough to press the barrel directly against the skin, which strongly suggests Rasputin was already down, already helpless, when that final shot was fired, not sprinting for his life the way Yusupov described. On top of that, researchers have noted Rasputin reportedly disliked sweet foods his entire life, making it unlikely he'd have eaten multiple poisoned cakes in the first place. and no trace of cyanide was ever confirmed in his system. The dramatic poisoning that opens the entire legend may never have happened at all. So here's what a more honest version of that night probably looks like. Several men, afraid of Rasputin's influence, lured him to a private location and killed him, likely with a direct close-range gunshot. Not a supernatural struggle against death. A calculated, premeditated murder dressed up decades later into a legend of a man too powerful to kill. Why did that legend stick so hard for so long? Because it was useful to almost everyone telling it. To his killers, it made their crime sound heroic, like they'd fought and defeated something monstrous. To his enemies, it fed the idea that Rasputin really was something unnatural, dangerous enough to require poison, bullets, and a river all at once. And to history itself, it was simply a better story than the truth. A man surviving cyanide and gunfire is unforgettable. A man shot once in the head in a cellar is just a murder. Rasputin's actual life was strange enough without the embellishment. A Siberian peasant with no path to power who ended up steering the innermost circle of a crumbling empire, largely because a sick child seemed calmer in his presence. He made himself impossible to ignore and impossible to like, and by the time powerful men decided he had to disappear, the truth of how that happened almost didn't matter. The legend was already writing itself. So was Rasputin unkillable? No, he died the same way most murdered men die, quickly and by a bullet. What actually made him unkillable was the story, and that story has outlived every single person who was in that cellar the night it was born.